Good evening, and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I'm Nate, and I'm joined by my co-host, JM. How you doing tonight?
Hey, I'm good, everybody. How's it going over there?
In addition to Anchor FM and pretty much every podcast listening service from Apple to Spotify, you can also find us on YouTube. We have a blog spot that you can find at chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com, which has a number of our translations as well as obscure texts that we were able to pull out of various magazines and other sources not previously easily accessible on the internet.
Yes, and when we finish this episode tonight, we'll present the list of what's coming, and one of those stories will be available pretty much only on our blog spot, so You should definitely check that out.
You can also follow us on Twitter at ChrononautsSF and on Facebook /Chrononautspodcast. So tonight we're going to be looking at a couple of stories beneath the sea. And this one took us a little longer to do than previous episodes. We needed an additional week. Normally we have these episodes going on a 4-week schedule for the reading period, and this one took 5. It might be a little obvious as to why that is when we get into the stories themselves, but I think overall we have a good bunch of stories for this time around.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes too, life just gets in the way of reading a little bit. So
yeah, exactly.
This is one of those times, kind of end of the summertime and all that.
Right.
Things are just starting to open up a little bit here. Been to a couple of shows for the first time in over a year.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Just things are sort of starting to happen again, I guess. So, yeah. But we're here now, and it's good to be back. Missed everybody. Missed you, Nate. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the last episodes we did with Traversing the Air, we're going to do a little bit of background on Traversing the Depth. And for this, we're looking at the book, The Illustrated History of the Submarine by Edward Horton. So, traversing the ocean and the deep, like traversing the air, have always fascinated humanity. This dates back to antiquity, from the Wrath of Poseidon and the Odyssey to the myth of Atlantis, which is related to us by Plato and will definitely come up again a couple times tonight. The myths of Alexander, like many Alexander myths, persist to the Middle Ages. But also, like the airplane, serious attempts to navigate the depths start around the time of the Renaissance. One of the earliest descriptions of a submarine, defined as a vessel that can not only dive below the surface, but propel itself forward once it's down there, is from a 1578 work by Englishman William Bourne, where a very modern conception of a submarine is described. It doesn't look like he actually built anything with these designs, but it showcases how early on people were seriously thinking about these issues and the possible practical solutions to them. In 1620, a Dutchman named Cornelius Drebbel made several demonstrations of some sort of submersible craft in London, but no drawings survive, and documentation of his efforts are both sparse and unreliable in nature. Similar displays were conducted by Nathaniel Symonds in the 1740s, but it wasn't until a few decades later that there were serious attempts at submarine usage in warfare. The earliest documented use of a submarine-type craft in warfare was in the summer of 1776 in the American Revolution. At the time, New York Harbor was then controlled by the British, and off Staten Island, a British patrol spotted a strange object. And when they went to investigate, the strange object explodes. Turns out that this was something left behind by the Turtle, which was a craft built by David Bushnell, a former Yale student. At the time, Washington's army was stuck in New York City, then composing just of Manhattan Island, with little in the way of today's bridges and tunnels. So there were only 2 bridges to Manhattan to the mainland in 1776, the King's Bridge and the Free Bridge, and they both connected the island with the Bronx. Bushnell had experimented with a number of novel naval weapons, namely exploding gunpowder underwater and several different types of floating mines. However, the currents and tide movements of the ocean thwarted any practical attempts at using mines because they were really hard to aim and direct, so he focused his attention on something that could be directly controlled. He built a one-man ship out of wood that looked like 2 turtle shells placed together, hence the name. And while primitive and a little silly looking to the modern eye, it was incredibly efficient, and the construction was able to withstand the pressures at the bottom of the harbor, which aren't particularly great, especially compared with some of the stories we'll be dealing tonight, it was certainly enough to make it an engineering factor that had to be considered. The turtle had 3 windows, enough air for 30 minutes underwater, and it had 2 handles which operated primitive propellers, one to submerge and one to move forward once it was down there. A foot pedal operated a valve which would admit water, and 2 pumps would eject this water to make the craft rise when it was time to go back up. But most importantly, it had a 150-pound keg of gunpowder attached to it, along with a line and an auger. So the idea is the submarine would ram the auger into an enemy ship, release any attachments holding the keg and the auger, and set it to explode with a timed device, allowing the operator a chance to get away. So during the night of September 6th into September 7th of 1776, this plan was put into practice. Ezra Lee of the 10th Continental Regiment was one of several people trained to operate the Turtle, and he was the one selected for its first mission. The mission was to attack the HMS Eagle, which was a 64-gun frigate operating in New York Harbor. Lee had a great deal of difficulty during the mission. He initially overshot the ship by underestimating the tidal flows and had to put in a great deal of physical effort in order to backtrack to make it to the target. When he finally made it, he inadvertently drilled into an area of the ship that consisted of the ship's metal hull support and was unable to get a solid lock into the ship with the auger. Since he only had 30 minutes of airtime underwater, and it was very likely that the tide and the currents made it very difficult to precisely focus on a single point, Lee abandoned the mission after failing to drill through. And when he was forced to surface for air, he was spotted by the British, and the British started to give pursuit. So it was here that Lee cut loose the explosive as a decoy, which then exploded in the water, setting the British into confusion, allowing him to escape. They made a few more attempts, none of them successful, and it appears that the craft was captured by the British when they took Manhattan Island, and was shortly afterwards sunk on a transport carrying it back. Bushnell's experiments overall had no effect on the war effort, but George Washington praised him to Thomas Jefferson, calling his work, quote, an effort of genius. Possibly the first practical submarine was invented by Robert Fulton, who is widely credited with the invention of the first commercial steamboat. In 1796, he began work on a craft that, like the Turtle, would deliver an explosive charge directly to an enemy ship. This craft, called the Nautilus, a name which we might see a little later in tonight's episode.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Was extensively tested in 1800, and in the following years, he unsuccessfully tried to sell it to various countries, including the French, British, Germans, and the Russians, but none of them were interested in a craft that they perceived to be a death trap for the crew. So as such, later designs weren't really produced. A German inventor, William Bauer, tried to unsuccessfully develop something similar in the middle of the 19th century, but it wasn't until the American Civil War where they began to be produced in more than just these random isolated numbers and actually used in successful attacks against enemy ships. Civil War era submarines seem to be where the story really starts for a modern practical submarine design. But for our purposes, I think that's where it's going to end, because the first story we're going to be looking at tonight first appeared in a serial less than 5 years after the American Civil War ended, and was no doubt directly inspired by these designs and events. And we are, of course, referring to Jules Verne's classic 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas.
So we have already talked about Jules Verne twice on Chrononauts, and this will be our third visit to this father of the science fiction genre. We are going to be talking about, again, one of his very early works. It was published originally serialized in French, of course, and the title was 20,000 lieues sous la mer. And in English, it's often referred to as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or perhaps more accurately, 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, plural, with the subtitle A World Tour Underwater. Now, this was published in serial form in Le Magasin de l'Éducation et Récréation between 1868 and 1870, and published in book form not too long afterwards. And we've discussed before how Jules Verne was one of the most translated authors of all time, pretty much, from the late 1800s onwards. He was very popular all over the world, including places like Japan, which we'll be covering a little bit later on.
Mm-hmm.
And he, of course, has been, as a result of all this, victim of some very poor translations. So I have actually read this book before, a long time ago, but reading this now was quite a new experience, and I feel like... So we have this William Butcher translation, which is a very heavily annotated, very much with all the extra material, minutiae, and the long introduction and appendices and manuscript comparisons and stuff. So it's very thorough.
He's pretty much the modern Verne scholar, and he really puts a ridiculous amount of work in all of his translations. And he's done a fair amount now. I don't think he's translated the whole thing because...
He wrote a lot of stuff.
He wrote a ridiculous amount. But he's certainly translated all the major ones.
And it does seem like the focus is largely on Verne's earliest work.
Yeah, which are generally considered to be his best anyway. I mean, I think this one, Journey to the Center of the Earth and From the Earth to the Moon, were all published within like 5 years of one another.
Yeah, but he kept writing for many, many years afterwards.
Oh, decades, yeah.
And wrote dozens and dozens of books, most of which are not read today. So I just think it's interesting that mostly he's venerated for the really early stuff. I guess you could say that he has that in common with H.G. Wells.
Yeah.
I mean, they're very different writers, but I suppose because of their popularity and more or less time period, although Wells was kind of a generation later, they are compared a lot. So, Wells really wanted to be this kind of cosmopolitan, like realistic writer of important fiction, whereas Verne just sort of kept doing his thing. And what his thing was largely, but not exclusively, Les Voyages Extraordinaires. And these are books dealing with journeys, often to strange locales in the world, or, like we said, to the moon, or to the Antarctic, or, generally exploration seems to be something that was a big deal to him.
Yeah.
His grandson, Jean-Jules Verne, said that Jules only had 3 major passions, and those were freedom, music, and the sea. And we definitely see a lot of that manifested in this book. Now, we talked about the William Butcher translation. There have been many English translations, obviously, of this book, and what I was getting at was earlier when I said I had read this book before, I must have read a cut-down translation.
Yeah. Butcher mentions the first one in English from 1872 cut out like 20% of the text, and a lot of subsequent English translations from the 19th century were based around that translation.
Yeah, and I think that might have carried on well into the 20th, actually.
Yeah.
I have honestly no clue what translation I would have read when I was younger.
Right.
But I think that I would have given up on it normally, so I feel like it must have been simplified and pared back.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, we'll get to talking about our critical feelings about the book at the end, but they're complicated.
Yeah, I would say so.
Now, in the Anthony Bonner translation, there is an introduction by Ray Bradbury. Bradbury, he puts in his usual sort of picturesque writing. He doesn't really have anything terribly profound to say, but what his major thrust is a comparison between this book and Herman Melville's Moby Dick.
Yeah.
Which may have been a slight influence. Our translator, William Butcher, maintains that he doesn't think that Verne actually read Moby Dick.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly lots of obvious parallels up front.
Yeah.
I mean, the endless description of the whaling industry as well as whales themselves and whaling ships from Melville really compare with Verne's description here of undersea creatures and environments, where he pretty much tries to stuff in everything he knows about the subject in the novel.
Right, and there's also references to like Paradise Lost and other stuff that seem to be in both, and it seemed to be like even like the last few lines of the books. Supposedly, now I can't remember because it's been so long since I read Moby Dick, but even Butcher has to admit that there are some blatant similarities.
Right.
So the reason he thinks that Verne didn't read Moby Dick was that it hadn't been translated into French yet at this time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good reason.
His English was not very good, so he probably wouldn't have read it in English.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, his first explorations outside of France were in Britain, and he spent some time in Scotland in 1859. And this was actually the inspiration for his first attempt at a book, which was Backward to Britain. And that book did not get published during his lifetime, actually, and it is among the later manuscripts that were not really unearthed till the end of the 20th century. So those were Verne's earliest works, and we've talked a few times already about Paris in the 20th century, and it probably looks like we might want to read it at some point. I think I'm a little bit done with Les Voyages Extraordinaires for now, but I wouldn't mind going into another area of Verne's writing. And this is something we want to talk about more later, but his publisher had a major influence on his direction and where he was going.
Absolutely. So
those early works did have a somewhat different direction in mind. However, as we will see, I'm sure most people know a little bit about this story, 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, but Captain Nemo, inventor and owner and captain of the Nautilus, has a very nice domestic arrangement inside his ship. Supposedly, Verne took this almost directly from his time at the House of Auckley in Scotland and was inspired by the settings of the library and the salon and so on to sort of base some of the interior construction of the Nautilus on this. So that's kind of interesting. After that point, he did travel a bit, and he did obviously enjoy sea voyages as much as he could. In 1865, he was influenced by one of his novelist friends, George Sand, who is actually a French writer named Amantine Lucille Miror Dupin. She suggested to him that the sea, or under the sea, was the one area to which his passion for exploration had not yet gone. Probably not true, because he still had a bunch of other places to visit, but I guess he was sort of inspired by that and some of the other popular fiction that was already around at that time, because indeed, Verne was not really the first to write a story about circumnavigating the Earth via submarine. One of the other books was by Aristide Roger, called Le Voyage sur les flots, and that was also serialized in 1867. And the name of that submarine was the Eclair, and it was also a book about somebody who circumnavigated the Earth under the ocean. But I'm going to guess that Verne's story was a little bit more venturesome, because that was certainly his thing. Now, in the Ray Bradbury introduction, he spends a lot of time, and I think this is kind of, in a way, Bradbury's sort of romantic nature, but he spends a lot of time describing how he thinks that Moby Dick and 20,000 Leagues are American classics, even though 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is not American.
Yeah.
But he says it's, sort of the ingenuity and he talks about Moby Dick and 20,000 Leagues and compares them, and he talks about the respective madness of the two captains, Nemo and Ahab. And he says that Ahab's is an evil, all-swallowing madness, whereas Nemo's is more, he thinks of it as more positive, and perhaps, despite the fact that he is a tortured person, could bring about good change in the world and stuff. And he's like, Ahab would build a hydrogen bomb to blow us all up, and Nemo would use that same knowledge to take us to the stars. So it's it's an interesting approach. I can kind of feel Bradbury's dreaminess in it. It doesn't really add anything scholarly to the text or anything like that, like the Butcher one does, but still kind of an interesting thing to see another author get so enthusiastic about one of his clear influences.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we'll go into talking about the book now. I think that most people probably know a little bit about this. They may have seen a movie. Perhaps there's other kind of... I wouldn't be surprised if there was like a graphic novel version somewhere. Didn't actually look that up, but it's been out there. And it's also influenced a lot of things. Captain Nemo has shown up in all sorts of things later on. I think he's one of the members of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but somebody could probably correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I
haven't seen any of that.
Alan Moore and a bunch of other people got together and they just basically threw together a bunch of famous 19th century characters. Right. And Dorian Gray is in there. I think Nemo is in there and stuff. But our story begins in 1866. When the seas are troubled by a mysterious visitant. It's believed perhaps to be a giant whale, and it's also mistaken for a shifting reef and perhaps maybe a fish. It could be anything, really, but it's the cause of such general consternation. The thing appears to move very fast and spouts huge columns of water into the air. And there's allusions to various sea monsters from classical mythology. And very quickly, I thought, which was kind of nice, sort of gave me false feelings about how fast-paced this book would be. But very quickly, we're introduced to a ship called the Scotia, which is rammed and almost sinks, but manages to limp into dock. And they find a neat triangular hole has been bored right into the ship. And it seems like they would instantly conclude that it was man-made based on how clean it was. But they still talk about it being a monster, and prongs or whatever entered and neatly exited. So our protagonist is one Dr. Aronnax, or Professor Aronnax. Oh, sorry, no, he's not a professor, but a geologist. And he's at the Paris Museum and hanging out. Well, he works at the Paris Museum, but he's hanging out in New York. He and his servant, Conseil, have just come back from Nebraska, I believe. I'm not really sure what they were doing there, but they were doing something there, not to do with the sea, presumably. And the possibility of a submarine has, in fact, already been brought up and discounted. And Aronnax has been reading about all this in the paper, and he speculates about all sorts of undersea creatures again. And it's pretty cool, but many ships have been harried, so the Americans are organizing a hunt from New York. Because Americans do that sort of thing, and Verne is very into that. He's into the ingenuity and the striving nature of Americans. So Farragut and the Abraham Lincoln are armed and prepared, but almost as if it knows, there's no sighting of the things for months. And they have gotten Aronnax and his servant to come on board because I guess they think that their expertise will be valuable, because they're still thinking at this point that it is some form of sea life. And so he's invited on board as a representative of France. And the Lincoln can travel at 18.3 knots, so it's pretty fast for its time.
Yeah, definitely.
Certainly not as fast as the monster, though.
Yeah.
And they think it's a big narwhal, and they set off in the good ship Lincoln immediately, and Conseil is sort of grumpy, because he's sort of like this. He's not really, he doesn't have a lot of agency in the book, but he's sort of there to just comment on everything that's happening. And we're introduced to Ned Land at this point, who is a big Canadian and experienced whaler, among other things.
Yeah.
And he and Aronnax develop a fondness for one another, and they talk a whole bunch. And the Canadian doesn't really believe in the monster because it defies all his experiences. And Aronnax tells him to be open-minded, but of course we already probably know what the truth is. So they have misgivings about the mission, but the thing seems to elude them, almost like, again, it knows that it's being searched for. But then, finally, after many weeks, there it is. And the thing itself, leeward on the weather beam. So, of course, they still don't know what it is, but it seems to be playing with them. Almost like a game of cat and mouse, and there's a chase, and the Abraham Lincoln stokes up its boilers and is going as fast as it can, and that monster is traveling at 30 knots, and it does circles around the Lincoln, taunting. And all in all, they travel about 300 miles, and after losing sight of the creature, they seem to come upon it. Maybe it's sleeping. Just one thing, though. It has a light on. And suddenly, the deck is absolutely drenched in water, and there's a gigantic impact. And Aronnax and Conseil are knocked into the water, and they manage helping each other to swim and stay afloat, and they find Ned, who's on the surface of this monster, or whatever it is. But he says he already knows it's made of steel, and not much happens for a while as the monster, which they now know as a ship, they come to that conclusion very quickly after touching it. So all the allusions to a monster and stuff, they just go away just like that.
Right.
It seems to be ready to submerge under the water, so Ned starts pounding on it really hard, and a hatch opens, and all these men come out, and they pull the stragglers in through the hatch. And they're in a prison-like room, and they speculate for a while, and these two men enter, and they're described as being very powerfully built, and especially the one who seems to be in charge. Verne, or perhaps Aronnax, is very sort of immediately taken by the physicality of this person. And they try to speak in several languages to the two shipmen. They try to speak in French and German and English and even Latin, but they don't seem to be getting anywhere. And Ned is really kind of getting cross, because that's what he does in this book. And he's rambling about not getting any food. But dinner is finally brought for them, and it's pretty goddamn delicious. So they eat this really nice meal, even though they probably don't know what any of it is, and they go to sleep. And they sleep for a really long time, and they awake thinking about their situation. And Ned, of course, is angry, and he wants to try and take over the ship. And he's becoming increasingly frustrated because nobody comes, and it takes a long time for them to get any attention. But when somebody does finally show up, Ned tries to attack him, and then there's this calm voice in French that tells them to listen. And this is the commander. He sort of introduces himself, but not really, because he doesn't really tell anything about himself. And that's certainly a recurring thing throughout the book, is that Nemo, for that, is who he is. Captain Nemo will not tell anything about himself, but he says that he is an outcast from society, and sort of says the three men are prisoners, but honored prisoners.
Yeah, right. He also could understand all four of the languages they were speaking to him, but was just testing them to see what their intentions were going to be. So immediately from the bat, he's portrayed as a man of great knowledge and culture.
Yeah, and he's also maybe a bit of a manipulative person.
Yeah, bit. Definitely.
Kind of, it's like, making them think that he doesn't understand. Now, the men on the Nautilus, they all speak a language which is never identified anywhere in the book. It might be Greek.
I assumed it was some kind of man-made cipher that they all speak to one another that Nemo devised himself.
Yeah, I mean, it's never said. Like, I want to get to this later, but it seems like there was a lot of disagreement between Verne and the publisher Hetzel about who Nemo actually was.
Right,
so
definitely.
I think this was Verne's way of just sort of saying, fine, then I won't specify anything.
Yeah.
Right.
That
makes Nemo himself, like, he could stand in for a lot of different political movements, which is kind of cool, actually.
Yeah, and I think maybe one of the reasons why this work was so popular and endured in the way that it has versus something else that would be more specific about who Nemo is and exactly what his intentions are.
Right. So Nemo is a fan of Aronnax's book. He's written a book about the ocean depths and life under the sea. And he says that the Doctor still has a lot to learn. And you shouldn't bemoan his fate, because now the two of them can explore together. And indeed, they go to lunch. And in the dining room, or the saloon, Aronnax and Nemo eat dishes from the sea, many of which are unknown to Aronnax, including turtle and dolphin meat. And Nemo rhapsodizes about the sea, its beauty and freedom. And they go to the library, which is, of course, very well stocked.
I think 12,000 volumes or something like that, and Nemo's read every single one.
Yeah, it's a lot of books that Nemo has, but nothing very modern, though.
Yeah.
He has a few like scientific modern books, but all his books about all his like historical books and novels and things like that are all older texts. So it's sort of suggested that the man out of time, he doesn't belong to the modern age, even though he's created this marvelous modern invention.
He does have a copy of Rabelais, though, which you'd want on any submarine.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was already an old classic by then. So.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah. And there's the salon, which is a beautiful room full of works of art and displaying vast collections of marine shells. And here we have the beginning of the exhaustive naming of marine life.
Yeah, I think up to this point, I was really enjoying it, and it was really well paced, and he's very good at sucking you into the story from the beginning, but there's a point where this book really, really starts to sag, and it's definitely around here.
It starts here, and this is almost like a glimpse of what's to come. And you read this, and you're like, wow, that's a really long list. And Butcher puts in a note about how Hetzel had scrawled in the margins of one of his manuscripts that he finds the lists very puerile.
Yeah.
Now, Aronnax is impressed by all this, but he wants to know how the ship itself works. So they go to the cabins, and Nemo explains. And he talks about electricity and shows him the various instruments and gauges. And it is a kind of electricity that Nemo says that people have not quite learned to harness yet.
Right. Back in the 1860s, really the only practical use of electricity was the telegraph. Dynamos had been demonstrated in the 1830s, but their design was super, super inefficient. And Wheatstone, Siemens, and Varley, independently of one another, would refine the design in 1866 and 1867. But a lot of the major improvements making the power generation technologies possible would come more in the 1870s. So Verne was pretty ahead of the curve here.
Yeah, definitely. The interior is very well maintained. It has electric lighting. It has temperature control. And the engines appear to be quite sophisticated. He does show Aronnax around and pretty much gives him liberty of the ship. When Verne is describing this, I mean, he describes the sort of the living areas as being quite like the salon and the library and stuff. They're quite large, but it still seems like the submarine might be a little bit cramped the way he describes it. And we'll certainly get to this as the book goes on, but there are something like 24 people on board this ship.
Yeah, right.
And I'm not quite sure where they all hang out. Like, it's really weird. I will say that in terms of actual character work, this is still probably the best Verne that we've read yet. If anything, just because of Nemo and what an interesting person he is.
Yeah, definitely.
But, like, apart from Nemo and the three interlopers, nobody else, all the crew of the ship, like, they might as well not be there.
Right, I think they're all unnamed.
They're all unnamed. They're never speaking in any language that the protagonists can understand.
Except for one exception at the end, which we'll get to then.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is really strange. It is strange how faceless these people are.
Yeah.
Nemo obviously very much cares about them, and I'm sure there's been fan fiction written since then about the crew of the Nautilus and what they were actually like and what they were up to. But that's not for our podcast. So, Aronnax is shown the way to the dinghy up top, which is what they use for exploration above the depths and occasional visits, perhaps, to land, although Nemo doesn't seem to ever want to be on land. In fact, he seems to almost abhor it. The dinghy is shot up using bolts and emerges very quickly to the surface.
Has a nice telegraph apparatus, too.
Yeah, it has a telegraph line to the Nautilus. And the control room and machine and engine rooms are at the back of the ship. And Aronnax does not see into the control room at this point, but says it's 16 feet long. So here, like, Verne does try to give the measurements of the ship, and it doesn't quite seem to add up to me. Like, I'm not sure where all these other people are supposed to be stacked. Like, yeah.
I've been on a modern, I guess you'd call it, submarine that was used as a museum exhibit, a decommissioned one. And in real life, they're super, super cramped. Like, you really can't fit more than one person in a chamber comfortably. And here they have at least room to walk around and not have to, like, make incredibly uncomfortable movements to get from one part of the submarine to
Well, that's
the
the
next.
thing, though. Like, they had these big rooms, but the way Verne described it, those rooms took out most of the volume
Right.
of the ship. So I'm just... The other quarters must be really cramped, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah,
So
I
those
mean,
poor
certainly
crewmen.
he has rooms to house collections that would put a lot of museums to shame.
Yeah. Yeah. So it can move 50 knots per hour, and the propeller shaft, operated by a complex system of levers, which are electrically motivated, moves at 120 revolutions per second, which is quite fast. And now they are continuing in through the sea, and they are at 137 degrees, 15 minutes west, traveling in a northeasterly direction at a depth of 50 meters. And they are off the coast of Japan. And Aronnax keeps trying to sort of subtly figure out where Nemo is from, but Nemo budges not an inch. Nemo, by the way, does mean no one or nobody in Latin. So it's obviously a pseudonym. Now, in the second manuscript, he's actually identified as Juan Nemo, but that was dropped. So there's actually at least 3 different drafts of this book that we currently know about.
Yeah.
And the one that we have, of course, is closest to the third draft, and many of the corrections or modifications were suggested by Hetzel, his publisher. And Hetzel was definitely a populist. He had in mind certain things that Verne and he got into some arguments about it, I guess.
Yeah.
And Verne's like, well, he could be a Polish patriot. He could be fighting the Russians. And Hetzel's like, well, he could be against slavery in the United States. And Verne's like, well, that doesn't make sense, because if he was, why wouldn't he just join up and fight, right? They couldn't seem to make an agreement. So in the end, I think Verne just decided, all right, I won't ever clue you in as to his nationality. Again, like, I feel like there's more hints about Greek than anything else, just because
Yeah.
stuff coming up later with Crete and stuff, and the Greek and Cretan independence and all that, and talk about the Greek language and all the mythological connections and so on. But
Sure. I mean, there's obvious parallels to Nemo and Odysseus here. Nemo being a reference to the Odyssey, and I think in text he has a copy of Homer with him. But in the Odyssey, resourceful Odysseus tricks the Cyclops and tells him, well, I guess in the Latin version anyway, that his name is Nemo, which means nobody. So when he wounds the Cyclops starts screaming to wake the other giants. Nemo, friends. Nemo's killing me now by fraud and not by force. And in response, all the other giants say, well, if you're alone and nobody's trying to overpower you, then
that
what's the problem?
Polyphemus has really lost his mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Ned and Conseil show up, and they've been reasonably well treated. But Ned is very cynical, and he wonders if the crew are also electric. And I kind of wondered the same thing. So they see out of a viewport schools of amassed fish. And Conseil gives a taxonomy lesson about fish. And Ned retorts after each with comments about their edible qualities. And this one was fun. So I didn't mind. I didn't mind if it kept up like this. I would have been all right.
Yeah, I like this bit a lot too. And Conseil throughout the entire work has this like obsessive classification hobby, but he's the kind of comic character that gets thrown in and does silly stuff and always has his desire to classify everything they come across, even though he's not really able to practically apply it towards any knowledge of what that fish or life form would do. Whereas Ned is the more practical side. He knows everything there is to know about the behavior and habits of fish in the aquatic life, but as far as the scientific classification, he could care less.
Right. There are some good humorous elements, and I wish that... I don't know, it's a delicate balance. Like, humor is very subjective, right? So obviously we're going to be spending the entirety of the book, more or less, on the Nautilus.
Right.
And one of the things that Hetzel had suggested was that they run into a bunch of Chinese pirates, and they end up with a Chinese boy stowaway on board the Nautilus who would be a comic relief character. And Verne just wasn't into that at all, which is probably a good thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But I do wish that because the glimpses of humor that are here are really good. And I think that it would have helped maybe a little bit if you just kept that up a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a couple of parts that are funny that we're coming up to later, but it's really just glimpses. But I did, like, even early on, when the Nautilus is attacking the Abraham Lincoln, Verne does this funny thing where he's, like, describing what happened, and he goes, "The frigate moved to avoid the center of the luminescence," and he's, like, saying that they got away. But then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, no, sorry, I'm wrong. Actually, we got rammed."
Yeah.
And it's just like, he's, like, just playing with the audience, and,
Yeah.
and I love that. And, you know, I mean, there was a little bit of that in From the Earth to the Moon as well, and again, he doesn't keep it up for long enough. Like, I feel like there's a good vein of humor that could be exploited, and I think, but this is mostly a pretty somber book, so
Yeah, I would say so.
you don't see a lot of it.
Yeah, and Kansei's humor is a bit one note. I mean, he pretty much does the same thing throughout the whole novel.
Yeah. Well, it's not that, like, it says Ned, you know, Ned and his commentary on Kansei's commentary, right?
Right, yeah.
And there's a later thing with the sharks that I thought was pretty funny,
Yeah.
too. But a week goes by in the sub's routine, and Nemo just doesn't show himself to his guests. He does this a lot. He just kind of goes, he disappears. Nobody really knows what he's doing. Like, is he in his room? Is he, like, in the control room? Like, they don't seem to know.
Yeah, much like his companion from Melville, he's really a quite moody character.
Yeah. And Aronnax hankers for him. Like, I mean, I don't want to be, like, a pointless shipper or anything, but, like, Aronnax really likes this guy. And he talks a lot about how much he admires him, and I guess that makes sense, because otherwise you'd think he'd be a lot more eager to leave, right? Like, Ned is really the only one who seems bothered by the fact that they're sort of in captivity.
Yeah. And Kansei pretty much does everything that Aronnax wants to do.
Yeah, I mean, he might sort of complain about it, and he might point out that something is dumb, but he won't, like, you know, he won't do anything on his own.
Yeah.
For the most part. Finally, though, Aronnax does get an invite, and it's for a hunting expedition on the island of Crespo, where Nemo apparently has forests. Well, it turns out that Crespos is just a lonely rock, and Nemo doesn't want to go on the island, but under the ocean, nearby the coastline, where they go wandering thanks to sophisticated breathing apparatus and electric light and powerful air rifles that fire electric discharge capsules. And Ned and Kansei are, well, at first they're going to accompany, but I think they decide to stay, or maybe Nemo doesn't invite them, I can't remember. So it's just the two of them.
Yeah, Ned refuses to go.
Yeah, Ned doesn't want to go.
Because he doesn't trust any of this diving suit stuff, and
No.
just thinks it's a bad idea.
Right. And they have the battery-operated light, and so they can see what they're doing, and it's this beautiful, strange, and extremely exotic undersea forest.
Yeah.
There's many hybrids of very weird life. He quotes this naturalist. I don't know if he ever names him, but he says, "It's a curious aberration where the animal kingdom flowers and the vegetable kingdom does not." So very, very otherworldly. I did think this part was really cool. I mean, there's a bit of the old listing going on, but it's very strange and psychedelic almost, the way he describes like all the undersea life and stuff, and how strange it all is. And they walk and they rest. They actually are able to go to sleep down there, which Butcher points out shouldn't really be possible given how their breathing apparatus works.
It also seems like an incredibly bad idea.
Yeah, it seems dangerous. And they wake up and there's a giant sea spider fixating on Aronnax. So yeah, it was a bad idea. Rather than having a air battle type situation, though, they make it to the island and then they turn back. And then at the very last moment, they shoot down an otter along with an albatross. The albatross is not an ill omen at this point. Then a school of sharks pass by, and Nemo and them hide, and finally they arrive at the Nautilus again.
Yeah, what I thought was an interesting note by Butcher here is that Verne personally was very much against and disgusted by the practice of hunting. And he makes a note here that is possibly commenting Verne's personal thoughts on hunting species into extinction.
But Nemo does a lot of hunting.
Yeah, he definitely does.
And we're supposed to kind of like Nemo, I think.
Yeah.
So I can't quite figure out that either. Like, I don't really know. I mean, definitely Verne's heart comes out here a lot of the time, with especially when it comes to humans, right? Like,
Yeah.
a lot of stuff coming up where he's talking a lot about how bad imperialism is and stuff.
Sure.
And it's kind of interesting because Verne is traditionally known as not somebody who's against that kind of thing, but I think that's just because so many of his stories are about exploring new lands. So
Right.
people just kind of assume that, oh, he wants to colonize them and he wants to, like, hunt down all the wildlife and
Right.
either enslave the local population or bring them up to our standards, right?
And plus, you never know what passages get cut for the juvenile editions or the poor translated versions
Yeah,
that
that's
were
right.
taken from the initial one. I mean, if you're cutting out 20%, who knows?
For sure, and I definitely don't remember any of that stuff from
Yeah.
back whenever it was. It was a really long time ago, though, to be fair, so...
Right. Right.
So they keep traveling, and they're now around the area of Hawaii, and traveling at a depth of 4,800 meters. And time goes on, and they pass several shipwrecks, and those are described in some grotesque detail that is a little bit reminiscent of Poe,
Yeah.
I thought.
Yeah, definitely. There's really grisly parts of this book that just kind of take you by surprise, and this is definitely one of them.
Yeah, because he's describing, like, the dead crewmen on the ship and how they're, like, half eaten by the elements
Yeah.
and by, like, vultures and stuff, and it's just, like, horrible descriptions of contorted split faces and stuff
Yeah.
like that, and it's, oh, yeah, it's pretty hardcore, definitely. So they keep going to Fiji and Vanikoro, and Aronnax is excited about Vanikoro because apparently there was a famous ship that got lost there.
Right. This is all in the real world, too. This isn't
Yeah.
something Verne's making up.
Yeah, so there's a whole story around it, actually. It's the tale of the shipwrecked French ships, and it's essentially a series of misfortunes surrounding the reefs around that area, which are very dangerous.
Yeah.
So there's something like 3 or 4 ships, some of which were, like, actually looking for the other ships that disappeared,
Right.
ended up getting run aground on these reefs and sinking. And Nemo has found the original sealed orders from Louis XVI, and he says, a coral tomb is a fine resting place for a sailor, and hopes a similar fate will one day befall him. It's now early January. Passing New Guinea, they enter the Straits of Torres, bound for the Indian Ocean. Despite Nemo's apparent confidence, Aronnax wonders about the dangerous reefs that destroyed so many ships. And indeed, the Nautilus does run into one. Nautilus says the tide will free them, and he's really not concerned. But he agrees to let the 3 prisoners go to this Gibberor Island. And Ned's really excited about the chance to perhaps get some land meat. So they get to Gibberor, and there's lots and lots of flora and plenty of fruit, but no animal sightings at first. Finally, they see some birds and parrots and pigeons and all kinds of birds, and they kill a few and then a boar. And just as Ned and Conseil are discussing maybe never returning to the Nautilus, there are signs of human company. And many natives emerge, and they make it back to the Nautilus just in time. And the natives seem unable to stir up some water transport for a while, so they're just kind of milling around, amassing in great numbers, looking at the strange whale thing, I guess. And meanwhile, the crew of the Nautilus are doing their fishing, and Ned is just grumbling about Nemo not taking any precautions. Finally, some canoes start coming out, and they start shooting arrows at the Nautilus. And Aronnax has a fun little conversation with Nemo, because Aronnax is always like, what about this and what about that? And like Nemo's like, oh yeah. He's acting so nonchalant. And he's like, oh, the hatches. Yeah, sure, I'll close the hatches. And he presses a button, and then he's like, there, it's done. The hatches are closed. Are you happy now?
Yeah.
And he's like insisting that they have not run aground, and they're just waiting for the tide. And they will be lifted tomorrow at exactly 4:40 p.m. They'll be on their way again. And he wants to open the hatches, and there's more like deadpan Nemo greatness. So it's at this point that Nemo electrifies the ship rail, and the Papuans who are attempting to hang on to the ship are instantly zapped and fall stunned into the water, and the rest of them flee in terror. And it's at this point that the tide does go in the Nautilus's favor, and it goes on into the Straits. So they're now around Timor, and there's various scientific experiments being performed on water density and other matters.
Yeah, one thing I thought that was interesting about all the talking about, temperature and depth and density and pressure is Butcher notes that Verne gets most of his facts and figures wrong here.
Yeah, I mean, he seems to be pretty good with the animal classification and stuff.
Yeah.
These figures, the math is way off.
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't have really noticed if Butcher hadn't pointed it out.
No. But I mean, yeah, Butcher double-checking Verne's math. I mean, you could tell the amount of love that goes into some of these works.
But when he points it out, too, like, the figures are way off. Like,
yeah.
If I hadn't been just trying to get through the book,
right,
then I probably might have thought about it, or like, that seems a little weird, but
right.
It's not like just a few meters or whatever.
Right,
it's
right.
way out there.
Yeah.
Some of it is based on what was known at the time, but some of it just seems wrong. So everything seems cool at first, but Nemo just seems troubled. And then he suddenly announces that he's going to have to lock up the 3 gassed prisoners. And back in the old cell they go. And then he even drugs their food, and they pass out. And they wake up in their cabins, and it's like nothing has happened. But Nemo is still not right-seeming, and he wants to know if Aronnax is a medical doctor as well, and if he can treat someone. So this seems to be, I don't know, I would have thought that Nemo, being resourceful, would have perhaps made sure that one of his crewmen had a medical experience. But you'd think so. But the man has had a serious head injury, and it looks like the result of violence, and there's nothing that can be done for him, and he'll be dead in a matter of hours.
Brain is basically leaking out of his skull. It seems
it's really bad.
Yeah.
And Nemo is really affected by this. He's almost seeming tortured. But there's another underwater excursion, and they have a sort of cemetery in the ocean where they conduct a kind of a ceremony, and the dead man is laid there.
Out of reach of sharks and men.
Yes. And Nemo hints that men are the trouble, much more to be feared than mere sharks. And then we end part 1 of the book. So that's precisely halfway through at this point. So this was originally the end of the first part of the serial. Toward the end of January, Keeling Island. Lots of beautiful sea fauna again, very wondrous. Too many to even attempt to describe for me. I'm not going to because it's exhaustive. If you really want to know more about fish and mollusks and ichthyology in general, read the book.
Yeah.
Nemo, Aronnax knows that they're prisoners, but he's just seeing so much, learning so much, that he wants to go on. He wants to keep going on this journey, though afterwards it would seem like he would try to escape. But Ned is, of course, in favor of liberty. And Conseil at this point thinks that Nemo is a misunderstood genius. But Aronnax feels that Nemo is involved in something about his hatred of society or the human race in general. which is what the original draft said, but this is not. This is toned down just a little bit from the original. It's not quite a misanthrope, but he speculates about what his motivation might be. He's wondering if it's revenge. And now they're entering the Bay of Bengal, and they see lots of dead bodies washed out from the Ganges. And sharks. Plenty and plenty of sharks. Ned's really pissy in general. Now, Nemo invites his guests to fish in the pearl fishing ways of Sri Lanka. But here comes the awesome humor, because he only tells Aronnax about the extreme level of shark activity in these waters. And Aronnax goes to read about it in this book, and he reads about all the sharks. And he starts to talk to Conseil and Ned about things, but he wants to sort of keep the truth from them, I guess. So he's like telling them about oyster diving and stuff, like pearl diving and stuff. But he keeps slipping the word sharks into the conversation without realizing, because it's on his mind.
Yeah.
So he's like, and this is just, Verne does this, like he's a bit of a didactic kind of writer sometimes. So like in the normal conversation, Aronnax just says, "An oyster has even been sighted, though I permit myself to doubt this, containing no less than 150 sharks." And Conseil's like, "Pearls."
Yeah, right.
Yes, pearls. And then he goes, "The fisheries of Sri Lanka are responsible for picking up 3 million sharks per year." And he does this a few times, and it's pretty good. Yeah, so they do actually have some pretty close encounter with a shark, I believe. And it's at this point that Nemo saves an Indian from being eaten, and he makes a statement against oppression and imperialism.
Yeah, definitely. Basically, he's talking about how these workers work this incredibly dangerous job that wreaks havoc on their bodies for almost no wages, while all the profits and harvest from the pearls go to their rich masters.
Mm-hmm. And there's no doubt that Verne is railing against this. So
yeah,
I think people should probably keep this in mind a little bit when they talk about his influence on like the Edisonades and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to be doing an episode on those later on, and I think they take a lot of Verne's, I guess, more intelligent societal commentary and just strip it down to more dumb patriotism. Yeah. But we'll see that when we get there.
For sure. And even some of the plagiarists that took directly from this book are way more racist than Verne was.
Yeah, definitely.
So now they're Oman, the Red Sea, and Egypt. Nemo insists that they will be in the Mediterranean in 2 days. And of course, Aronnax doesn't believe him. But he's like, well, we have to round the Cape of Good Hope and cross Africa and all that. But Nemo's like, no, there's an undersea passage that I discovered. I call it the Arabian Tunnel. And it links both seas. Wow.
Yeah, the Suez Canal was under construction at the time, but it wasn't finished. So the route would be inaccessible by normal ships. But certainly people were thinking about that for quite some time, because it would cut sea travel by a significant amount.
Yep. And Nemo knows the secret.
Yeah.
So finally we see Ned catches sight of some strange marine life. And here we go with it's a whale. It's a mermaid. But no, it's a dugong or halicore. And it is often mistaken for a mermaid. And it's a rare cetacean. And they're apparently almost extinct. But Nemo encourages Ned to hunt it anyway, which is strange. I mean, it's not me saying they're almost extinct. It's Nemo saying they're almost extinct.
Right.
So I'm not sure why he wants Ned to hunt them down, considering that he seems sort of opposed. But
yeah, sometimes the book feels logically inconsistent with what Nemo says and does.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, on the whole, I think he's a pretty good, interesting, consistent character. But it's just, there's some things that I wonder sometimes how much, like, I wonder what that first draft was really like in full.
Right.
It's possible that Hetzel was also a good influence on Verne's writing, but it does seem like he asked him to tone down a lot of things. Butcher says that, like, Verne had this propensity for sexual metaphors, and Hetzel didn't really like that.
Right.
And Hetzel also had him insert more religious morality into the text, but it was, like, not very meaningful religious. Like, it was more like just random asides about God that didn't really add anything to the text.
Right.
So it seems like Sometimes I feel like maybe he should have just left him alone a little bit more. And who knows what we'd have gotten then, maybe. But, I don't know. It's all right. I mean, he obviously helped him to sell. So that was probably what kept Verne writing for so long. So I guess we have to be grateful in a way. But it just does seem like perhaps he cramped him just a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, he definitely put his thumb on the scale.
Yeah. So they pursue the dugong, and it's a large example of its species. And yeah, it might be impossibly large. Butcher says the largest ones are much smaller than this. I can't remember exactly, but it's really big, and there's a lot of really big things in this book, so it makes sense. They play cat and mouse for a while, with the creature being only slightly wounded, before it decides to push the attack on the boat, and they're nearly capsized, but Ned gets the better of it, and he stabs it to death relentlessly. And they tow it back home, and they catch a bunch of birds, and once again they have lots more meat. And finally, Aronnax gets invited into the pilot's cabin for the first time. And they cross the Suez Isthmus in 20 minutes. And Nemo is in one of his cagey periods now, a bit later, and Ned is really getting on his escape train. He really, really wants to be free. And Nemo is a little more locked down now that they're in European waters, it seems. And they hardly surface at all. And Nemo meets this diver, and they exchange some signs and gold. And he seems to be a member of the Cretan Revolutionary Force, or at least that's what Aronnax thinks. They enter a boiling sea caused by volcanic activity. Nemo seems almost to be taunting Aronnax at this point, and they finally leave the Greek Isles into the Mediterranean. Nemo's not fond of it, and they race through, with Aronnax lamenting on their poor fishing, and mollusk classification is not going well because they have to move too fast. And I'm just saying, thank you, Captain. And there's speculation about the eventual cooling and death of the Earth, which sort of comes out of nowhere, but is really awesome. And there's a glimpse of more shipwrecks leading to the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Atlantic. Now they're heading north, and Ned has finally had enough, and he says, I'm planning to escape tonight, and I am counting on you, Aronnax. You must give me your word that you'll help. And Aronnax doesn't seem to want to go, and he feels bad about Nemo. He doesn't want to leave him. I mean, he loves what he's doing, and he probably loves Nemo too, in a way. Here we get one of Verne's few concisions to the idea of real tension and suspense, as Aronnax paces around the sub and eventually ends up in Nemo's empty cabin looking at his portraits of patriotic and liberating martyrs.
He has quite a few of them, for sure.
Yeah, he does. Yeah. And these seem to be the people that he admires, perhaps. There's liberation figures from, history.
Yeah, I think they have Leonidas, O'Connell, the defender of Ireland, Abraham Lincoln.
Okay, yeah, I knew there was an Irishman in there somewhere.
Yeah.
In the salon, close to the allotted signal time that Ned has proposed, Nemo abruptly comes in and starts telling Aronnax a story about Spanish history. And I really thought at this point, it felt like he was leading up to some ominous pronouncement about Aronnax, like he had overheard them or something.
Yeah.
And Aronnax really thinks this too, so it's a really tense moment. And you can just sort of picture it in your head. Nemo is looking at him, and he's telling him this story, and you think that he's leading up to saying, and now I'm going to throw you off the ship, or something. But that doesn't happen, and they're in the Bay of Vigo, on the ocean floor, collecting treasures from ships meant for the Spanish that were sunk in 1702. And Nemo insists that he doesn't hoard these riches for himself, but puts them to good use. Possibly in aiding various revolutionary goals, we think. So Nemo invites Aronnax to accompany him over an undersea mountain and into a petrified forest. And there are countless huge shellfish and octopuses. And it is a volcano. And it's in fact Atlantis. And he says this is between 12 and 40 degrees latitude. Aronnax is, of course, overwhelmed, and he wants to cross the entire continent on foot. And there's all sorts of crazy speculation about the inhabitants that doesn't really read like speculation, like the way it's done. It's kind of strangely detailed, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's interesting. This whole part was an interesting little diversion.
Yeah. A lot of recalling from Plato.
Yeah. So yeah, he talks about how the inhabitants lived for centuries, and he talks about the Bible, and he wonders if the undersea mountains might rise up again someday. And after a whole day of fish watching, Aronnax awakens to find that they are floating in an underground cavern. And Nemo says that this is his harbor, and there are coal mines and reserves of sodium for the electric batteries on the Nautilus. And the three guests go for a wander again, and they find beehives and birds, and they fall asleep in a cave. And here Aronnax dreams of being a mollusk, and then awakens to find the tide coming in really fast. So they have to get out of there really quick and back to the Nautilus. Now they move on to the Sargasso, and it is still and calm. Nemo wants to do soundings and see if they can verify the depth of 52,000 feet. I'm not sure. I actually sort of switched at this point back and forth between the audiobook version and the translation, because the book was taking me a very long time to read, so so the measurements were all converted in the other version. So
right, and Verne's math is off anyway. So
yeah, Verne's math is no good. So in the French and in the Butcher translation, most of the time it's meters.
Right.
So they photograph the depths, and the Nautilus can't take too much pressure. 22,000 atmospheres is just too much. So they shoot up to the surface again, and the Nautilus arrives amidst black baleen whales at this point, and Ned talks about hunting, and there's tension between him and Nemo. He hasn't given up thinking about escaping, of course. Conseil is worried about Ned at this point, and by the end of the chapter, so is Aronnax. They see some sperm whales attacking the baleens, and Nemo doesn't like those particular cetaceans, so he uses the Nautilus like a harpoon to massacre them.
Yeah, this is another one of the parts that are like really gory and kind of like out of tone for the rest of the novel.
There's bloody carnage everywhere. They find a dead pregnant whale that still has milk, so they like take all the milk, and it's apparently a delicacy, and I don't know if anybody really drinks whale milk. Maybe they do.
I'm not sure either.
I don't know.
They might talk about it in Moby Dick. It's been a couple years since I've read it.
Yeah, they probably must. Yeah. But now it's announced that Nemo intends to reach the South Pole, and they travel south into ice floes and get stuck temporarily. And the theory is that so far south there will be open sea at the pole, and indeed they seem to break through to it.
Nemo's been reading his Sims.
He has been reading his Sims, all right. They don't find the hole, though. But in order to determine if they're really at the pole, they must take the sun's position. But for days, it won't show itself, and they have arrived right before spring equinox, which means that the sun won't be visible in this area for a whole 6 months. So they really cut it pretty close there. And there's discussion of seals, various kinds of whales. The sun finally does show its face, and noon, they're at the pole, more or less. And Nemo does this really grandiose speech, and he does this twice in the book, and it's pretty awesome when he does it, because he starts off like making a list, as Verne is wont to do, of all the various explorers and how far they reached, which is seldom more than 70 degrees, which we talked about in our exploration of the Hollow Earth stories already. And as he's going on with his list, he just gets grander and grander as he declares that he, Nemo, has reached 90 degrees and claims possession of this land under his own name.
Yeah.
And he unfurls a banner with an N on it. Now, the Nautilus runs into an ice barrier and gets surrounded, and they can't move, and they start to run out of air. They use the batteries to heat the area around them, and then the men start chipping away at the ice, all the while getting weaker and weaker due to lack of oxygen.
Yeah. It seems like they're in real trouble here, and this is one of the few points in the book where Nemo really seems like he's going to lose everything.
Yeah, he really screwed up here. And even Ned is helping out, and they eventually do manage to break through. Aronnax almost doesn't make it, but eventually they're able to breathe. And of course, now they have traveled from the icy regions of the pole to Tierra del Fuego, way out there in South America. And here is the battle with the giant squid, which is a very famous scene from this book. Probably, if anything, the most famous scene from this book.
And it's definitely one of the best parts of the book.
Yeah. So it's not just one squid either, which I'd forgotten about, but it's a whole
it's a lot of them.
Like pack of them.
Yeah.
And
it's really cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. These beasts are like monstrous. And again, he talks about the legends of ancient sea monsters and giant squids, and Ned is like, there's no way that a squid that large exists. And not too long after he says this, they see evidence that, in fact, it does.
Yeah, this giant 8-meter squid just shows up.
Yeah, there's all these huge squids, and of course, like, the thing about the squids, right, themselves, they're pretty big, but their tentacles reach, like, longer than them, so they can snag something from many, many meters away, and this is, in fact, what they do, and this is where Nemo loses another man, and as the man is being held aloft by the squid, and just like shaken and almost dismembered before their eyes, he calls out for help in French. It's the first time he's heard any member of the crew speak French, or indeed any language besides whatever tongue they're using, which is never revealed, which I think is actually really kind of a neat touch.
Yeah,
even if it was ultimately the result of Hetzel's interference.
Yeah.
Ned Land is also nearly killed, but Nemo actually saves him at the last moment. And Nemo has become increasingly reclusive and unwilling to spend time with Aronnax. And now, after losing the man, he seems kind of heartbroken and more morose than usual, even. They keep traveling north, and Ned thinks that they're heading for the other pole, and he's just really annoyed. But he knows that they're also heading into waters that he knows very well, like the St. Lawrence River.
Yep.
And it's here that Aronnax again makes an impassioned speech on Nemo's behalf, and he speaks of his personal admiration for Nemo, despite not really understanding some of his purposes and actions. Ned likens their position to slavery, and because Ned has become such a loose, unpredictable person, Aronnax actually goes to Nemo, and he's like, "Are you going to free us? And I really like you," and he's, talking about how much he appreciates the captain and his great work, and he's really buttering him up, but he says, like, we're kind of being kept here against our will. I mean, I like it here, sort of, but what about those two guys?
Right.
Especially Ned. Like, what do you think somebody like Ned would do being kept in captivity this long? And it's a really good question.
Yep.
And Nemo doesn't really seem to care. And he's immovable on what he said 7 months before. And indeed, they've been on the ship for 7 months now. And he says, "I'm keeping you here, and if you ever bring this up again," well, he doesn't really finish that thought, but he's like, basically, "Don't ever say this to me again."
Yeah.
So that was a failure, and then there's a huge storm right after that, and the Nautilus is driven really far to the east, so there's no chance of escaping into the St. Lawrence or anywhere like that now. And now Ned is just as much of a recluse as Nemo is, just hanging out in his cabin, which he shares with Conseil, just sort of brooding. And now they find themselves in waters around Ireland.
Before they get to Ireland, and they're still off the shores of Canada by Heart's Content, there is one really funny offhand line where they spot the submarine telegraph cable, which goes from North America to Europe, and Conseil thinks it's a huge sea serpent.
Yeah. So Aronnax is wondering if Nemo will take him home. Nemo shows up, and he seems to be looking for something, and he finds it and seems satisfied. It's a ship on the ocean floor, the remains of the Revenge, the French ship that went down with all hands. And hail the Republic!
Yep.
Hail the Revenge! And Aronnax, he's basically called it at this point. Maybe it is about vengeance. and there's a ship that appears and starts firing on them. It's a warship of some kind, but Verne never reveals, and Aronnax never sees what nationality the ship belongs to.
Right.
I kind of thought maybe it was an English ship, but now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know exactly what made me think of that.
Yeah, he can't tell. I mean, it could very well be an American or who knows ship.
Well, I mean, we're kind of in the English Channel at this point, right?
Yeah, but Nemo's definitely pissed a lot of people off by sinking random ships, and who knows who could be looking for them.
Well, yeah, it's definitely looking for them, I think.
And
so there's another sea chase, and the Nautilus submerges and remorselessly rams the warship and sinks it. And they watch it go down. And Nemo, rather than crying out with victory, he actually seems quite upset. And he runs to his cabin, and he stares at a portrait of a woman and children and bursts into tears. And something has definitely gone amiss. I mean, maybe it's just Nemo's mental state, which is kind of what it seems. The ship seems in a daze, and the charts are not even being updated anymore, so they can't really figure out where they are, or at least Aronnax can't. And Ned spots land nearby, and he, again, plans a night escape. And on his way to the library, Aronnax hears Nemo playing the organ, which I didn't mention before, but he has an organ that he plays sometimes.
He really is a very well-accomplished man.
Yeah, and he's a great musician, and he plays these... he plays this sort of vaguely Celtic-sounding music on his organ, and I think that, according to Butcher, this is something that's emphasized more in the first draft, is Nemo's compositional ability.
Yeah.
So that somehow this got taken out in favor of classification of marine life, but that's the way it goes. Nemo is unaware of Aronnax sort of looking in, and he's crying, and he whispers, "God Almighty, enough! Enough!" And Aronnax is somehow afraid, and he rushes to the dinghy where his friends are waiting. And just as they're about to... Well, they just unbolted the dinghy, and all of a sudden they hear this shout from the ship. "It's the Maelstrom! The Maelstrom!" screams the crew, and now they realize all too quick that they are perhaps in Norway at the site of the Maelstrom written about so eloquently by Monsieur Poe, and they are being pulled into the whirlpool. And Nemo scuttled the ship, or so it seems. How do they escape? It's not clear. But they do. At least Aronnax, Conseil, and Ned do. He never finds out who Nemo is, or what country he's from. He sort of hopes that Nemo survived, though. He's still in awe of all that he's seen, and even of Nemo himself. And he hopes that the judge will perish, and the great scientist will emerge to continue exploring. And that's the end of 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. So that's the end of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Before we get into general thoughts and things, do you think Nemo survived?
Yeah, I do. And I think canonically he does, although apparently Mysterious Island, the somewhat sequel to this, really plays with the timeline and what happens to Nemo.
Well, I'm thinking just discounting the fact that there is a sort of a sequel.
Yeah. I mean, it seems grim, but I think that Ned, Conseil, and Aronnax would have a tougher time surviving than Nemo, who can just take his ship underwards rather than them in the little lifeboat who are just stuck on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really think about that end of things. It just really seemed like Nemo was scuttling the ship. Like, it seemed like he just had enough, and he wanted a grave in the sea, and that... But was he maybe doing that so that he could hide, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, who knows?
Like maybe he was tired of killing
Yeah.
people, so he kind of figured, all right, now they're after me, so I either like keep killing until somehow one of them gets me, or I just pretend that I'm gone from the world and I operate more covertly from here on in.
Yeah, because he really doesn't have to interact with human society in any way. He pretty much can get anything he needs from the ocean itself, and he's
Right.
self-sufficient entirely in that way.
I'm just wondering, like, what this means for him. Like, it seems deliberate, for sure. Like, it doesn't seem like an accident. He knew where they were going. He
Yeah,
knew
right.
that they were. So, he either planned it that way. I mean, I guess there's either he just wanted to end it all, or he really wanted Aronnax to escape, or he wanted to change his mode of operation so that he would be more, like, hidden. Like, it seemed like he was going around sinking ships and
Right.
doing very obvious things, so eventually the world would know about him and they'd probably get him
Yeah.
one way or another.
Yeah.
So this way, it seems like he's dead. Aronnax reports that he was lost in the maelstrom, and maybe he'll even send up some, like, I don't know, maybe he'll send up some kind of evidence, like false evidence indicating that the ship is, gone. I don't know.
Yeah, but Aronnax hears nothing at all whatsoever as to the fate of the Nautilus. There's no evidence
No.
that it was destroyed, and there's certainly no evidence that it survived. Presumably, Aronnax is relating the end of this a couple years after the events of him being on the ship
Yeah.
itself.
Lovelorn Aronnax.
Yeah, right. But I mean, if there were more mysterious ship sinkings or sightings of strange lights as witnessed by Aronnax, that would make waves in the same way that it did previously when the whole story
Yeah.
started.
Well, that's kind of what I was thinking. Like,
Yeah.
he realized, maybe Nemo actually realized that he'd gone too far.
Yeah,
Because, like, instead of being all happy when he sunk the ship towards the end, he was, like, devastated. Like, it's almost like he was expecting some kind of release, and instead of getting that, it just made his soul, like, heavier. And he's, like, sitting at his organ playing and saying, it's enough. And,
yeah,
like, he doesn't want to continue anymore. But maybe it doesn't mean suicide. Maybe it just means, like, from now on, I'll do what I say I would, wanted to do and not be associated with humankind. And that means not sinking ships anymore and not, like,
right.
like maybe I should just, I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, it does seem like Verne is sympathetic in theory to the general sort of causes that Nemo seems to stand for, although those are not gone into because of the disagreements, perhaps, that he and Hetzel have.
Right,
had
but
over-
he still makes it pretty clear in a vague sense that he's against oppression and systemic human suffering and exploitation and that kind of thing.
And he wants colonies to be independent, for
Yeah.
sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And in theory, he's supposed to be, I guess, fighting on their behalf. But
Right.
it seems like a lot of the ships he does sink in the course of the novel are those that are attacking him and firing directly upon him, rather than sinking any kind of, I don't know.
Maybe. I mean, that ship, the Scotia, seemed pretty innocent at the beginning. I
Yeah,
don't know.
right. Yeah, well,
Like,
that's what I mean. He wasn't sinking the ships of like slavers or something like that. You know what I mean? Like he just seems to be attacking random vessels.
Yeah. It doesn't seem very helpful to any cause per se. I mean,
Right,
it does seem like
yeah.
money changes hands. Like, he talks about getting signs from this diver, and I think he gives him some gold.
Yeah.
So, and they're indeed, like, rescuing or salvaging all these treasures off the ocean floor. And he also has his own sources of coal and stuff like that.
Right.
So, I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, I really think that there hasn't been a character so far in Verne that you can really talk about much besides Nemo.
No, I agree. Yeah.
Nemo is just this really interesting, enigmatic figure. Kind of reminds me of, like, I don't know, even later on in French, I think he was more of like an evil mastermind, but he's still kind of fascinating. Like somebody like Fantomas, for example,
Mhm.
and all these like weird, almost Superman who were like scientists and inventors, and they had some weird power, and they operated on behalf of some mysterious cause. And instead of being portrayed as entirely evil, they were kind of sympathetic,
Right.
in a way.
Yeah.
And
And Nemo is certainly portrayed as being very cultured and very learned, and he can do everything and knows everything. And he, even though I guess technically keeps the three main characters prisoner, he's very hospitable to them and treats them well, and he appears to very sincerely care for his crew and is very affected when the two crewmen die in the course of the novel.
Yeah. I do think, I don't know, it is really interesting what is left unsaid. I mean, it does kind of frustrate me that, yeah, there's all this crew that Nemo cares for, but we don't know any of them.
Yeah, it is kind of odd how they're just like these faceless, anonymous people, but yet Nemo seems to be very deeply invested in them.
Right. It's just Verne doesn't want to write about them.
Yeah, well, yeah.
It's the same thing that bothered me sometimes in the Moon books. It just didn't seem like, I don't know, he has his things that he just wants to write about, and he doesn't want to, like, get into certain things, and sometimes it might, I don't know. I mean, if there weren't so many fish and mollusks...
Yeah, right. I would have definitely taken some cool supporting characters over a couple marine paragraphs, but I don't know. I think the 1860s, 1870s reader would have maybe appreciated those kind of long descriptive passages more than the modern eye and the view that we have of the sea now through like nature documentaries and things like that.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up because we were talking about that.
Yeah.
Like, well, they didn't have any nature documentaries in 1870, so
right.
I could see somebody enjoying all that more than I did.
Yeah.
I do think that in many ways this is the best Verne book that we've read. Like, in many ways.
I don't know. I think that, for me anyway, Nemo is by far the most interesting character in any of the Verne books we have, but this is probably my third favorite of books overall of his that we've read, in that I think the plot really, really drags for like a good 2/3 of the novel. I mean, going through the summary, it does feel like they go to more places and it's a little more exciting than maybe it is. There are some passages that really just go on over and over again with a list.
Yeah, there's whole chapters where nothing really happens. Yeah. But I don't know, I thought the scope of this one was really good. I don't know, I mean, I do think that Journey to the Center of the Earth was it was a quicker read. Like, it seemed a lot shorter. I think it actually was.
It was shorter. This is the longest one out of the three we read. Well, I guess technically 4, but...
Yeah. I liked it, ultimately, but it was...
No, I did too.
I was frustrated when reading it, though.
Yeah. I mean, the good parts are really, really good, but it does sag in the middle quite a bit, and it took me a long time to get through this one. Longer than it normally would. Yeah, me too.
Definitely longer than it should have, and so there were also a lot of interesting little quotes and things like that sprinkled throughout the text, little aphorisms that usually come from Nemo. I think there's interesting sort of double meanings to some of them, like you don't know, it doesn't really sound like a threat, but you think that it could be.
Right.
Like at one point he says, he's talking to Aronnax, and he says, there can be no secrets between those who are never to part. And it's like pretty much implied early on that he's going to keep them there forever.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It
actually does remind me, and I know I always do this, but it reminds me again of the early Doctor Who stuff.
Right.
Where he just kind of kidnaps them, and he's like, well, I guess, I don't want anybody else to know about this thing, so even though I don't really know if I like you yet, I'm just going to take you all over the universe. And I mean, it's just, what does he plan to do? I mean, I especially don't see how he didn't worry about Ned. Like, in some ways, it makes me wish there was just a little bit more interiority to this somehow. Like, because but then again, it's part of the great enigma that you never really know what Nemo is thinking.
Right.
One of the things that keeps you fascinated, I think, is not knowing what he's thinking.
Yeah.
And I really like that, but it's also frustrating at the same time. So, it's I'm of two minds about it, but ultimately I see why Verne did it this way, and it does make him a more compelling character almost than if his ideology and his like purpose and everything about him had been just spelled out.
Yeah.
Like even if it was something admirable, you'd be like, oh, okay, and that is something that some of the plagiarists do, is they add those details that are perhaps not necessary or wanted.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the plagiarism for a minute, because there's some really fascinating examples here. There was an article that was initially published in the February 1997 issue of Dime Novel Roundup by James D. Keyline. And the article is Jules Verne, Bracebridge Hemming, and Edward Stratemeyer, a case of 19th century plagiarism. So in 1873, Bracebridge Hemming wrote Dick Lightheart, or The Scapegrace at Sea, which was published serially in the magazine Young Men of Great Britain. And shortly following it, an unauthorized edition appeared in America in 1874, as well as other bootleg publications in the following years. And Dick Lightheart was one of these series where he goes from one adventure to the next, and this time he's in the submarine. So a lot of events are essentially plagiarized with the serial numbers filed off, if could put it that way. But he doesn't lift direct text, but he lifts the ideas, the scenario, and the basic characters. But
right, and this is one where they give the reasoning behind Nemo is that he thought that he lost his wife and she remarried, and there was some kind of what nationality was it? I don't remember. Like, it was kind of lame. That's my point. Like,
right.
It was, if Verne had done something like this, maybe it wouldn't have been good. And maybe the fact that he and Hetzel argued about it was just a sign that maybe it was best just to not even say anything.
Yeah.
Even if that makes the book seem like less politically confrontational, that could be a good thing in this case, right?
Right.
So,
yeah. But that's not where this plagiarism story ends, or why it's an interesting example, because 20 years later, a story appeared in the magazine Young Sports of America in 1895 called The Wizard of the Deep, or The Search for the $1 Million Pearl, written by Theodore Edison, which is a pretty obvious pseudonym. And it was later published in book form in 1900 as Wizard of the Sea under the name Roy Rockwood. Roy Rockwood was a pseudonym that was commonly used by the Edward Stratemeyer organization, which was a publishing organization owned by Edward Stratemeyer, who else, where he hired a team of writers to churn out dime novels at an incredibly fast pace based around like some ideas and sketches he had. And he created some series that are still very well read today, including The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, as well as others that were more popular with people in prior decades, like the Bobbsey Twins and Tom Smith. But regarding Wizard of the Sea, Keyline identified that the first 6.5 chapters are pretty much a reprint of a previous Stratemeyer story, Bright Days, but from that point onward, it turns into the Dick Lightheart story, and turns into in the sense where it doesn't incorporate plot elements or names, but rather the exact same text. And Keyline estimates that roughly 75% of the submarine portions of Dick Lightheart are word for word lifted, with only 1% of those being changed in some form. And he provides a lot of highlighted text comparisons, and it's just really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it's really blatant, man.
Yeah, it's very blatant. And I wasn't able to find the original, well, I guess original is probably the wrong word here, but the first lifted Dick Lightheart on the internet. But Wizard of the Sea, the twice removed plagiarized example, is on Gutenberg. I'm sure reading the two back to back would be quite the experience, but unfortunately we weren't able to find the first.
Yeah, but you'd also be dealing with the translation from French of the Verne. I mean, what were they working with at that time? You'd have to get one of the...
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely interesting that that kind of thing happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Verne would seem to have been just so popular at that time that you'd think that somebody would point it out fairly quickly.
But then again, you can't chase down every bootleg publication. And it seems like there were a lot of magazines and sketchy publishers that did this frequently, just lifting other people's books.
But the Stratemeyer was pretty prestigious, I assume, right? Because they came out with all these properties.
Right, yeah.
So it's not just some crappy little bootleg magazine.
Right, yeah.
And there's also a film of this one.
Yeah, this one was pretty good.
Yeah, I like it too. I mean, it's the changes are there.
Yeah, I think they mostly serve the plot and a 2-hour film format, and it is Disney, so it is lighter in tone. You know, Ned is more comic in the film, and I pictured him more of like a gruff, serious man in the novel.
And he plays guitar and sings.
Yeah,
in the movie,
right, exactly.
And he's like kind of a fun guy, right?
Yeah.
So
there's also a pet seal they have on board.
Oh yeah, yeah.
One interesting but minor change they made is Conseil is not a servant of Aronnax, but rather his apprentice. And I think that kind of class issue of having servants doesn't really play well for American audiences. They made a
Yeah.
similar change in the Lord of the Rings movies when Jackson did it between Sam and Frodo.
Was Sam supposed to be Frodo's servant?
In the novels, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'd forgotten that. It was so long ago when I read those. I mean, they were such a part of my childhood, but now it's been 30 odd years. So,
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But, wow, that actually does make sense, though, because Kansai is always really into the taxonomy and the sea life and all that stuff. Like, kind of makes sense that he would be the apprentice, right?
Though he doesn't really do much in the film, which is kind of a shame, because I did like his character in the novel.
Yeah, he doesn't really do anything, does he? What did you think of the sub design?
Oh, the set design and the underwater photography in particular are really, really good. And the monster effects are cool when they have the squid fighting scene. It's really well done production-wise. I mean, it is a Disney production, so they did have a fair amount of money to throw at it.
Yeah, I think they put a lot into that production.
Yeah.
Even though, what is it, from 1957?
Yeah, it's in the 50s sometimes, somewhere around there.
It definitely seems like it was. I mean, there were a few Verne productions from around that time, but I don't think any of them quite had the clout that this one did.
Yeah, no, this one mainly captures the novel's points. The ending is different, and I don't know if it's necessarily for the better, but for the most part, they are relatively following the beat of the novel, even though there are minor changes here and there, and how the scenes play out and some of the nature of the characters. I think for the most part, it's a really good adaptation of the source material, especially when you consider you're watching a 2-hour movie and not like a 10-hour TV show or whatever.
Yeah, I think it works good and well in that format. I don't really think it needs to be... I mean, I get where we're going with this new era of TV, but I don't necessarily think everything needs to be a miniseries.
No.
Like a 2-hour movie is about perfect, I think, length for this story. So, I mean, obviously it seemed a little bit more kid-friendly, I guess.
Oh, it definitely does,
Disney.
Yeah.
But it is a live-action Disney production, by the way. It's not one of the cartoons that they were so known for.
Yeah, Ned is played by Kirk Douglas.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Who is the Nemo actor?
I didn't recognize the actor that played him.
Okay, well, he seemed to be pretty good as well.
Yeah, he is. It's well acted. It's definitely well acted.
He is the really interesting character in this, and in Verne's oeuvre so far, like his most interesting characters are ones that seem somewhat to copy that model, like Robert from Master of the World and so on. Like, almost seems like a more, I don't know, maybe slightly more insane Nemo or something, although I guess Nemo's mental state is questionable at the best of times.
Yeah.
It just seems like this is a kind of character that Verne does very well. Professor Liederbrook was pretty fun, but he was a bit more like just your cantankerous old uncle kind of character.
Yeah.
There's usually only like one character that really stands out, I find. If you're prepared for that, and if you don't mind that, I would certainly recommend this book. You'll probably race through all the descriptions of the animals, although some of them are really cool. Don't get me wrong, like especially when they go to the underwater forest. Like, that was really beautifully done, and I actually do remember that from my earlier reading. Like, I just kept thinking to myself, there couldn't possibly have been that much because I would have given up reading this book at age 10 or whatever.
There is a lot, and as much as Butcher does try to elevate Verne to the level of, like, Balzac and Zola for the 19th century French greats, I don't think he's quite there. When he's good, he is really good, but I think this one was a little uneven, although I would recommend it on the whole.
Yeah. It was still, I think it was still my favorite Verne, even though I had the same frustrations that you did.
Yeah.
It took me even longer to read it than I took me to read it. So, you know, it was just, but I don't know, the feeling of it was more satisfying in the end. Like, I actually felt emotional when I finished it.
Yeah. No, the ending was great.
I would say, like, the others, like, especially From the Earth to the Moon, especially with that one, like, I just felt no real, beyond satire, there was just no emotional connection at all with anything in that book.
Right.
So, I mean, it was cool, but it was just like, wow, I'm glad it's short.
Yeah, right.
This one was a lot longer, so the things that Verne does that I don't necessarily like, there's a lot more of that in here, but overall, I did think this was the most satisfying and the one that made me feel like I'd gone on a journey that was interesting and met somebody who was interesting, even if it was only one person and not 24 or however many are actually on board the Nautilus.
Right.
I mean, there are weird things about it, for sure. And as much as Butcher goes on about the translations being poor in the past and stuff, I found his a little bit clunky sometimes.
Yeah.
Honestly, like, there were a few sentences that just kind of made me go, what? Like, I don't know. But he even said that, like, some of the original translations had good style, but they weren't faithful. And I guess that's that's his thing, is he wants to be faithful. So maybe that's Verne, not the translation. Maybe Verne is just that kind of writer.
It could also read differently in French, and it is hard to sometimes bring things across and how things flow.
I don't remember the exact sentence, but it was something like, the terrified natives ran screaming in terror. Like,
yeah, right.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
He's most definitely very scholarly in his approach.
Oh, absolutely.
To doing this.
Yeah. And you can tell he legitimately loves working with these Verne books. I mean, it's what comes across in all of his commentary, and he puts so much work into all of his translations. Like, it's pretty ridiculous how thorough and detailed he is with his notes.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, like, it does kind of slow down the reading if you want to really delve into those notes, but they're there, and you can just sort of, like, it adds so much to the text, and it is sometimes more interesting than his lists, than Verne's list. Yeah. So I was saying when we were talking about the book that it often felt sort of like something a sort of an obsessive somebody who works in information technology or something, or software development might do. Yeah. Just like, obviously that's not even a thing in the book, but it's just all these, this almost obsessive need to keep categorize things and list things. And, and like when the Nautilus is going fast, Conseil and Aronnax even lament the fact that they can't really do that anymore. Right. And like the modern reader is probably going, oh, well, I'm really happy about that. Like, maybe Nemo should stay on edge so that they keep moving and they don't have time to observe so much, or keep the viewports closed for a change. Yeah. But no, I despite coming down hard on that aspect, I really don't think there was that much to complain about with this. I'm just a slow reader, and it was a hurdle sometimes getting through those chapters. I had to adjust my reading habits for this book somewhat. I ended up doing that a bit with Angel of the Revolution as well, actually, but...
Yeah. That was much longer than this, and it was... this is much better than Angel of the Revolution, although Angel of the Revolution, you could tell, probably does take some cues from, if not this, then, I mean, Verne is cited directly.
Verne in general, for sure. Now, that's something else that I wanted to bring up that I almost forgot. So, Natas and Nemo, they're kind of similar, aren't they?
Yeah, they definitely are.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for those that don't know, last time we did The Angel of the Revolution by George Griffith, and that was a book about a revolution, obviously, and that had the power of really fast, lighter-than-air travel and could drop all these awesome bombs on unsuspecting targets, especially Russian targets. And it was it's the kind of book that it was more fun to describe than to read. It's kind of the opposite of a Stephen King book. Like, when you try to summarize a Stephen King book, it just sounds really, really silly. Right. But when you're reading it, it's kind of fun. Yeah. But when you're talking about Angel of the Revolution and you tell somebody what it's about, they're like, wow, that sounds amazing. And then they actually read it, and it's just like, I don't know if I like this. Yeah. So, Natas was this figure of great power who orchestrated the revolution, and, he was somebody who had a tortured past, and he was someone who had this goal of overwhelming the existent social framework and replacing it with a new and better one. Yeah. Although he kind of left the new and better one to his subjects, I guess. Right. I don't know. It just seemed way more juvenile and just dumb, whereas Nemo, as much as it sounds ridiculous on his face for him to be able to speak like 8 languages and have collections that rival the greatest museums in the world, he does really feel like a sophisticated person, and it comes off more in the text than somebody like Natas or the characters of Angel of the Revolution that feel like these weird caricatures that aren't in line with reality. Nemo feels like he could exist
in the world.
Yeah, not only that, but you want to, if not follow him, like admire him.
Yeah.
Whereas Natas, like, he kind of mind controls people when he has
right,
to.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it's just an interesting thing, because I kind of wish that reading this now, I'm like, wow, if Natas had been more like Nemo, that would have been kind of cool.
Yeah.
Right? Because on paper, or not on paper, but when you talk about it, Angel of the Revolution sounds awesome. You just have to give all these caveats that it's not really as awesome as it sounds. Like,
no, it's
whereas
definitely
this
not.
book, whereas this book, like, it has this awesome character that book needed at the center of it to make it as good as it could have been.
Right.
And this one gets bogged down a little bit in the marine detail, but otherwise, you feel like by the end, you almost want to, you want to champion Nemo too. You want him to, you want to almost go to him in that last scene where he's at his organ crying, and you almost want to go to him and comfort him.
Yeah.
It's just like suddenly that feeling comes over you, and there's nothing like that in a lot of the other books that are kind of in this style, I think.
No, definitely not.
This kind of plot
Yeah.
line. You wouldn't find that in Dick
Lightheart. Yeah.
Lightheart. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think for now we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be going to a very Jules Verne influenced, but quite different work from Japan.